Claude responded. My grandson stopped breathing for 11 seconds in a hospital bed in Tulsa, while my son-in-law's family was arguing about whether they were entitled to move. My grandson stopped breathing for 11 seconds in a hospital bed in Tulsa, while my son-in-law's family was arguing about whether they were entitled to move into my late wife's cabin for the 4th of July. I was 68 years old, sitting in a vinyl chair that had gone cold under me hours ago, when my phone lit up with a message from my daughter's mother-in-law, Carol. Not a question about the baby. Not a word about the machines beeping around him. Just a photo of a printed spreadsheet with cabin sleeping assignments for 14 people, and a caption that read, "Just confirming everyone's arrival times for Friday. Hope the room list looks good. I want you to understand something before I go any further, because I know how these stories usually go, and I know what you're already picturing. I'm not the villain here. I'm also not entirely innocent, because for 6 years I let this family treat my late wife's cabin on Lake Tenkiller like it belonged to all of them, and I never once said the word no out loud. I said, we'll see. I said, let me check the calendar. I said everything a coward says when he doesn't want to be the reason a Thanksgiving turns cold. My name is Walter. My wife Eleanor passed 4 years ago from ovarian cancer, and the cabin was the last thing she asked me to protect. Not sell, not rent out, not fill with strangers. Protect. She'd inherited that land from her own father, a man who built the place log by log after he came home from Korea, and Eleanor spent every summer of her childhood catching bluegill off that dock. When she died, she left the deed solely in my name, with one condition scrawled in the margin of her final letter to me. Keep it quiet, keep it small, to keep it ours. I read that letter maybe 40 times in 4 years, and every single time I'd been renting it out to 14 people for a week, I felt her handwriting burning a small hole in my chest. My daughter, Megan, is 34. She married a good-hearted, weak-spined man named Trevor 9 years ago, and Trevor comes with a mother, Carol, and a father, Gary, and 2 brothers, Kyle and Brent, both of whom have wives and children of their own now. Somewhere around year 2 of Megan and Trevor's marriage, Carol decided the cabin on Lake Tenkiller was the family place, as though Eleanor's father hadn't bled blisters into his palms building it with his own hands. Every summer since, the group chat named, with zero self-awareness, Lake Life Best Life, would light up in early June with Carol announcing dates instead of asking for them. My grandson, Caleb, was 14 months old. He'd been born with a small hole in his heart, an atrial septal defect the doctors said would likely close on its own by age 2, nothing to panic over, just something to monitor. 3 days before that 4th of July weekend, Caleb spiked a fever of 104 and started breathing in a way that made Megan's hands shake so badly she could barely dial 911. By the time I got to St. Y. Francis Hospital in Tulsa, my daughter was standing in a hallway with her back against the wall, sliding down it slowly like her legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold her up. The doctors used the word myocarditis. They said it can happen with viral infections in babies with pre-existing heart conditions, that his heart muscle was inflamed and struggling, and that the next 48 hours would tell them whether he needed to be transferred to a pediatric cardiac ICU in Oklahoma City. I stood outside that room with my hand flat against the glass, watching wires run into my grandson's tiny chest, and that's when my phone buzzed with Carol's spreadsheet. Megan had posted in the group chat the day before, plain as day, Caleb's running a bad fever. We're heading to the ER just to be safe. Might need to push the cabin trip. Carol had liked the message with a thumbs up emoji and then, less than 18 hours later, sent room assignments as if the words heading to the ER had evaporated the moment she finished reading them. I typed back one line. Caleb is in the hospital. This isn't happening this week. Carol's response came back in under a minute. We already booked our flights from Kansas City. Gary took vacation days. We'll just keep to ourselves and let you all handle the hospital stuff. As though my grandson's heart failing was a scheduling inconvenience she intended to work around rather than acknowledge. Trevor, to his credit, tried. He wrote, Mom, maybe we push it a week? And Carol wrote back to the whole chat, Gary's had this week off for months. We are not rearranging our entire summer around a fever. A fever. That's what she called it, even after Megan had typed the word myocarditis in capital letters 20 minutes earlier. I sat in that hallway chair with my thumb hovering over the keyboard, and something inside me that had been quiet for 6 years finally spoke up in a voice that sounded almost like Eleanor's. I typed, understood. and set the phone face down on my knee. Megan looked over at me, exhausted, her eyes rimmed red. Dad, what does understood mean? It means I finally understand something, I told her. I should have understood it years ago. I want to tell you the drive to the cabin took hours, that I agonized the whole way. But the truth is, it took me 4 minutes to make the decision and the rest of the night to actually leave the hospital because I would not walk out of that building until a cardiologist named Dr. Osei looked me in the eye and told me Caleb's oxygen levels had stabilized enough that the immediate danger had passed. Megan gripped my hand in that hallway and said, "Go, I've got him. Go do whatever you need to do." She didn't ask what that was. I think some part of her already knew. I hadn't been back to Lake Tenkiller in 8 months, not since I'd closed it up for the winter. But I still had every code memorized, still had the number for Dwayne, the property manager who'd looked after that stretch of shoreline for going on 15 years, and had known Eleanor since she was a girl in pigtails, running down that same dock. I called him from the truck at 11 at night. He picked up on the second ring half asleep. "Dwayne, it's Walter. I need the locks changed on the cabin. All of them. Tomorrow morning, first thing." There was a pause, then his voice, careful. "Everything all right, Walter?" "No," I said. "But it's going to be." I told him to disable the garage code, to swap out the deadbolts on the front and side doors, and to make sure the boathouse padlock was replaced too, since Kyle had a habit of taking the pontoon out without asking whether anyone else needed it. Dwayne didn't ask a single follow-up question. He'd watched that family treat the place like a free resort for years, and I think, in his own quiet way, he'd been waiting for me to say something for just as long as I had. I drove through the night and got to the cabin a little after 3 in the morning, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. I let myself in with my old key one last time before Dwayne arrived to change everything, and I walked through every room Eleanor's father had built with his hands. I pulled the family photo albums off the shelf in the study, the ones with pictures of Eleanor as a child, because those weren't staying in a house where 14 strangers-in-law would be leafing through them while my grandson lay in a hospital bed 40 minutes from crashing. I cleared the fridge of anything that would spoil, disconnected the propane tank on the grill, and closed every blind in the house so it looked exactly like what it now was. Closed. I taped one sheet of paper to the inside of the front door glass, facing the porch, in handwriting Eleanor would have recognized as mine from 41 years of grocery lists and birthday cards. "This home is closed to all guests until further notice. Family emergency." By 7 that morning, Dwayne had every lock swapped and had reprogrammed the garage keypad to a code that existed only on my phone and his. I sat in my truck in the gravel driveway drinking gas station coffee, and at 9:52, my phone buzzed with a text from Kyle. "Hey, we just landed in Tulsa, driving to the lake now. What's the address again, lol?" I didn't answer. At 11:14, Gary called. I let it go to voicemail. At 12:40, Carol called 4 times back to back, and on the 5th attempt, I finally picked up, mostly because I didn't want her calling Megan at the hospital and adding one more weight onto my daughter's chest. "Walter, the door won't open. Something's wrong with the code." "Nothing's wrong with it," I said. "I changed it." There was a silence on the line so complete I could hear wind moving through the trees around me. "You did what?" "Carol, my grandson has myocarditis. He may be transferred to a cardiac ICU today. My daughter is watching monitors, wondering if her son's heart is going to hold. And your family flew in anyway, to a house that isn't yours, expecting me to have towels folded and the grill ready. We didn't want to intrude at the hospital. We thought it'd be easier on everyone if you just what? Vacation 40 minutes from a hospital where a 14-month-old is fighting to breathe and let me handle it? That's not consideration, Carol. That's convenience dressed up as kindness." She started to say something about how Gary had taken vacation time, how the kids had been looking forward to the water park in town, how they weren't trying to be a burden, and I said the only thing I had left in me. "There are 2 hotels in Tahlequah with vacancies. I checked this morning. I'll text you both numbers. That's the only help I'm offering today." I hung up before she could answer. The way you close a door gently instead of slamming it, because slamming it gives people the satisfaction of thinking you lost control. I hadn't lost anything. For the first time in years, I'd found something. 14 people stood in that gravel driveway for the better part of an hour, according to what Dwayne told me later. Since his property borders the lot and he was out mowing at the time, close enough to see everything without ever getting involved. Kyle tried the garage code 4 separate times. Brent's wife sat on the porch steps with a toddler on her hip, fanning herself with a paper map of the lake. Gary walked the perimeter checking for an unlocked window, the same way my father-in-law used to walk his fence line looking for a break, except my father-in-law had actually built what he was walking around, and Gary had never once picked up a hammer for that house in his life. At some point, according to Dwayne, one of the kids, maybe 8 or 9 years old, asked loud enough for anyone nearby to hear, "I thought Grandpa Walter said we could always come here whenever we wanted." Nobody had an answer for that child because nobody wanted to explain that whenever we wanted had only ever meant whenever it was convenient for us, never for the family whose blood had actually built the place. Trevor called me around 1 in the afternoon, and his voice was different from his mother's, quieter, almost ashamed. "Walter, I'm sorry. I told them to wait. I told them this wasn't the week." "I know you did, Trevor." I saw the chat. "What do you want me to tell them?" "Tell them to go to Tahlequah. Tell them I love this family enough to stop pretending everything's fine when it isn't." That evening, while I sat in a different hallway chair, this time watching Caleb's oxygen numbers climb back toward normal on the monitor above his crib, Brent posted something on Facebook. I didn't see it myself until an aunt of Megan's forwarded it to me the next morning. But the gist of it was this: drove 12 hours with our kids to see family and got locked out of a house we've been going to for years. Some people care more about being right than being family. No mention of Caleb. No mention of the words myocarditis or cardiac ICU. No mention that Megan had posted about the fever the day before, or that I'd offered 2 hotel names within an hour of the first phone call. Within a few hours, cousins I hadn't spoken to since Eleanor's funeral were sending me messages, calling me cold, calling me controlling, one second cousin actually typing the word heartless, which, given the organ we were all currently praying over in that hospital room, felt almost too on the nose to be real. I sat next to Megan's hospital bed that second night, Caleb finally sleeping with his tiny chest rising and falling in a rhythm the machine said was steady, and I found myself scrolling through old text threads on my phone the way you pick at a scab. I went back 3 years, then 5, then all the way to the summer after Eleanor passed, and I started writing things down on the Notepad app, dates and dollar amounts, because somewhere in the last 6 years I had become the family's unpaid handyman, insurance policy, and silent bank, and nobody had ever once said thank you in a way that meant anything. There was the $11,000 I'd wired Gary and Carol in 2021, when Gary's landscaping business nearly folded, money I told myself was a loan and never saw a cent of back, watched instead sit in their driveway as a new fishing boat 8 months later. There was the roof on their house in Broken Arrow, $6,000 in materials, and 11 days of my own labor, the same 11 days Eleanor and I had set aside for our 40th anniversary trip to Hot Springs, a trip we canceled and never rescheduled because Gary said the water damage couldn't wait, and I, fool that I was, believed him more than I believed my own wife's patience wearing thin in the passenger seat of my truck as we drove north instead of south. There was every propane refill, every dock repair, every grocery run before every single 4th of July and Labor Day weekend for 6 straight years, money and sweat that had all quietly funneled out of my accounts in my back and into a family that had started referring to Eleanor's father's cabin as simply the lake house, as though the specific man who built it had never existed at all. By the time Caleb was cleared to go home 4 days later, thinner and paler than I'd ever seen him but breathing steady on his own, I had a number sitting in that Notepad app. $58,120, not counting labor, not counting the 2 anniversaries and 1 Christmas I'd sacrificed to keep that family's expectations fed. Megan noticed the Notepad open on my phone while we were driving Caleb home, propped in his car seat in the back, finally asleep without a single wire attached to him. "What's that, Dad?" "Homework," I told her, for a conversation I should have had 4 years ago. I called a family meeting for 3 weeks later, once Caleb was steady enough that Megan felt safe leaving him with a sitter for an afternoon. I picked my own house in Broken Arrow, not the cabin, because I wanted everyone sitting on furniture I'd bought with money I'd earned, in a kitchen where nobody had ever once helped with the dishes, so there'd be no confusion about whose hospitality they were currently standing inside of. Gary showed up first, arms crossed before he'd even sat down, the same posture Eleanor used to call his "I already know I'm right" stance. Carol brought a fruit tray nobody asked for and set it down like a peace offering that had absolutely no connection to the actual conflict. Kyle and Brent came separately from their wives, and Trevor sat closest to me, closer to my side of the table than his own family's, which told me everything I needed to know about where his loyalty had quietly landed over the last 4 days. Before anybody says anything, Gary started, I think we're owed an apology for what happened at the lake. That was humiliating, Walter. I agree it was humiliating, I said. For everyone standing in that driveway and for my grandson, whose heart was struggling to keep beating 40 minutes away while you all argued about a garage code. Carol's chin trembled. We didn't know it was that serious, Walter. You have to believe. Megan told the group chat the word myocarditis, in capital letters, 18 hours before you sent a room list. I set my phone on the table, screenshots already pulled up, the timestamps lined up in a neat little column that no amount of remembering it differently could argue with. Nobody reached for the phone to look closer. Nobody needed to. They all remembered exactly what they'd written, because guilty people always do. I slid a single printed page across the table to each of them, one line at the top in plain black text. What I've given, and what changes now. $11,000 for the landscaping business, never repaid. $6,000 in materials and 11 days of my labor on your roof, the same 11 days that were supposed to be my 40th anniversary with my wife. Approximately $41,000 in groceries, utilities, dock repairs, and propane at the lake house over 6 years. A house that belonged to my late wife's father, not to this family, not ever. I looked up from the page. $58,120, and I'm not asking a single person in this room to repay a cent of it. Kyle scoffed. So what, you're just telling us this to make us feel bad? No, I said. A man trying to make you feel bad sends a bill. I'm telling you because I want it said once out loud with numbers attached, so nobody in this family can ever again pretend they don't know exactly what this cost. Brent brought up his Facebook post, defending it the way people defend things they already suspect were wrong. I was upset. We drove 12 hours. You drove 12 hours to a house you were told, in writing, not to come to. And your post didn't mention my grandson's heart condition once. Not once, Brent. It wasn't the place to get into all that. It was apparently the place to call me heartless, I said, and let that sit in the air a moment. Take the post down or leave it up, and I'll post the group chat screenshots underneath it myself, timestamps and all, and let people draw their own conclusions. Brent's jaw worked for a second, and then he said nothing, which told me the post would be gone before dinner. Carol tried one more angle, the oldest one in the book. We are your family too, Walter. Eleanor would have wanted us all together. I felt something in my chest crack a little at Eleanor's name coming out of Carol's mouth, and for one long second I nearly folded the way I always used to. Then I thought of the letter in the drawer of my nightstand, Eleanor's handwriting slanting across the page. Keep it quiet, keep it small, keep it ours. Eleanor, I said slowly, asked me before she died, to protect that cabin and to keep it small. Not to fill it with 14 people who never once picked up a hammer for it. You didn't know her wishes because you never asked. You just assumed the house belonged to whoever showed up. Gary tried the last card he had. After everything we've done for this family, this is how you treat us? You raised a good son in Trevor, I said. I'm grateful for that, genuinely. But that doesn't buy you a lifetime claim on my late wife's house, or my bank account, or my time. I looked around the table at each of them in turn. New rules, starting today. Nobody uses the cabin without Megan or me personally inviting you. No more assuming dates. No more informal loans. I'll help in a real emergency, the way I always have for my own daughter and grandson, but I'm done funding anyone's vacations or roofs or boats. And if anyone ever again uses a sick child as a scheduling inconvenience, they lose access to this family's homes entirely. Nobody argued, nobody yelled. The silence in that kitchen said more than 6 years of group chat notifications ever had. Before Gary left, he told me I'd torn this family apart over a house and a fever. No, I said. I stopped pretending it wasn't already broken. Kyle didn't speak to me again for almost 4 months after that afternoon, and I won't lie to you, that silence cost me some sleep. He was still my daughter's brother-in-law, still someone I'd watched grow from a gangly teenager into a grown man, and there were nights I lay in bed wondering whether I could have drawn that line without quite so much blood on the floor around it. What I noticed instead, as those 4 months passed, was how much lighter my own life had become. Money that used to disappear into other people's boats and roofs started staying exactly where I'd earned it. I finally took the fishing trip to Beaver's Bend. I'd been promising myself since Eleanor passed, Just me and a cooler and a rod. 3 days of silence that belonged entirely to me. My knees still ached climbing into that truck most mornings. A lifetime of construction work finally sending its bill, but at least I wasn't spending my weekends fixing another man's roof for free. My relationship with Gary and Carol never fully healed, and somewhere around month 2 I stopped expecting it to. Gary never once apologized, not in so many words. Carol sent stiff, dutiful texts around the holidays that read more like obligation than warmth. I didn't cut either of them off completely, because Trevor was still my son-in-law and Caleb still had grandparents on that side who loved him in their own limited way, but I stopped being the automatic answer to every crisis in their lives. When Gary's truck transmission failed that winter, I gave him the name of a good mechanic instead of driving over with my toolbox the way I always used to. He wasn't thrilled about it. He handled it anyway, and something about that felt like justice finally arriving quietly, without fanfare. About 5 months after that kitchen conversation, my phone rang, and it was Carol. I braced myself the way I always used to before answering her calls, that old familiar tightening in my chest. She didn't announce a visit. She didn't ask for anything. "Would it be all right," she said, hesitating in a way I genuinely never heard from her before, "if Gary and I came by this Sunday, just to see Caleb?" No agenda. It wasn't an apology, and I want to be honest with you about that, because I don't want to hand you a fairy tale ending you didn't earn by reading this far. It wasn't some movie moment where 6 years of resentment dissolved in one phone call. But it was the first time in longer than I could remember that she'd actually asked instead of announced. "Sunday afternoon works," I told her. "Caleb naps until 2. We'll come after his nap," she said, and that was all. The following spring, Megan, Trevor, and Caleb drove out with me to the cabin for the first time since that 4th of July weekend. Caleb was almost 2 now, steady on his feet, and he ran straight down toward the dock the moment I opened the truck door, chasing a duck that had no interest in being chased, laughing the specific laugh only a healthy child can laugh. Megan sat on the porch steps with a cup of coffee, watching her son the way you watch something you nearly lost. I walked up to the front door and checked the lock out of habit more than anything else, the way a man checks his own pulse after a scare. It didn't feel like a weapon in my hand anymore. It was just a lock, the same kind every house in America has on its front door, the plain and ordinary right to decide who walks through it and who doesn't. I've thought a great deal these last months about what the real cost of all this turned out to be, and what the real payoff was. It wasn't the $58,000 sitting in that notepad. It wasn't the image of 14 people standing confused in a gravel driveway on a hot July afternoon. It was something quieter than either of those things. It was making sure my grandson grows up understanding that love was never supposed to mean handing people access to your life whenever it's convenient for them, regardless of what it costs you. Megan came and sat beside me on the dock that afternoon, dangling her feet over water her own grandfather had fished in 70 years earlier. "Any regrets, Dad?" I watched Caleb toss a handful of gravel into the lake, delighted by the smallest splash a toddler has ever produced. "Only one," I told her. "I regret waiting 6 years to say the one word that would have saved us all a lot of grief a long time ago." If you've ever had to draw a line with the people who are supposed to love you the most, you already know it never comes easy, and it almost never comes clean. But sometimes the family worth protecting isn't the loudest one in the group chat. Sometimes it's the quiet one, sitting beside a hospital bed, waiting for you to finally notice they were the ones who needed you all along. Claude responded, "Sometimes the people we love the most learn to take because we never taught them how to be told no. Sometimes the people we love the most learn to take because we never taught them how to be told no." A locked door isn't cruelty, it's clarity. The kind that lets real love finally breathe again. The ones worth keeping close will meet you there, in the quiet, long after the noise fades, still choosing you. A small note for you. This story was imagined and written by AI purely for entertainment, though we hope the honest little lesson tucked inside it stays with you a while.